In the late autumn of 1872, New York Harbor was a forest of masts and a symphony of boring industry. The air was thick with the scent of roasted coffee, wet hemp ropes, and the salty tang of the Hudson River. This was the Gilded Age of sail, a time when the world moved at the speed of the wind, and the rhythmic creak of wooden hulls against the pier was the heartbeat of global commerce. Among the hundreds of vessels moored along the East River was a brigantine of modest size and elegant lines, the Mary Celeste. She sat low in the water, her hold filled with a cargo of spirits, 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol, and the quiet dreams of a captain seeking a peaceful passage to Genoa, Italy. The sound that defined this morning was the muted clatter of horse-drawn carts on cobblestones and the rhythmic thud of barrels being lowered into the dark, cool belly of the ship. Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs, a man of boring and steadfast character, watched the preparations with a stoic calm. He was not a man of high seas drama. He was a man of routine and ritual. Beside him stood his wife, Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia. To them, the Mary Celeste was not just a merchant vessel, it was a floating home, a wooden sanctuary designed to carry them across the vast, rhythmic Atlantic. The architecture of the departure was a slow and meticulous process. In the days leading up to November 7th, the crew, 7 experienced sailors of boringly reliable reputation, worked with a rhythmic precision. They checked every inch of the rigging, the canvas of the sails feeling like heavy, dry skin under their calloused hands. The sound of the wind whistling through the lines was a soft prelude to the journey ahead. Inside the cabin, Sarah Briggs arranged the boring domesticities of life. A small melodeon, a reed organ for music, a sewing machine, and Sophia's wooden toys. These were the anchors of normalcy in a world of water. On the morning of their departure, a thick silver mist hung over the harbor, softening the jagged edges of the Manhattan skyline. The Mary Celeste moved away from the pier with a gentle, rhythmic sway. There were no grand cheers, only the low grumble of the anchor chain being hauled up and the boring splash of the water against the bow. Captain Briggs took his place at the helm, his eyes fixed on the horizon, a siren song of blue that promised a steady, uneventful voyage. They were leaving the noise of the city for the deep, rhythmic silence of the open sea. The cargo of spirits and quiet dreams. The 1,701 barrels of alcohol in the hold represented a boringly industrial mission, yet they carried a hidden weight. The cargo was volatile, susceptible to the rhythmic changes in temperature and pressure. The captain knew the risks, but his confidence was built on years of meticulous navigation. As the ship cleared Sandy Hook and felt the first true pulse of the Atlantic, the rhythm of life on board shifted. The chaotic clatter of the city was replaced by the symphony of the ship, the rhythmic snapping of sails, the steady groan of the timber, and the constant, boring hiss of the wake. As the coastline of America faded into a thin gray line, the Mary Celeste became a world unto itself. For Captain Briggs, this was the essence of the Gilded Age of sail, the ability to vanish from the world's sight and exist only in the rhythmic present. He kept a boring and detailed logbook, marking the wind speed, the coordinates, and the monotonous beauty of the weather. There was no hint of the mystery to come. There was only the rhythmic breath of the ocean and the quiet dreams of a family safe within their wooden walls. The the rhythmic lull of the deep. By the time they reached the mid-Atlantic, the days had become a meditation in motion. The sun would rise with a slow amber glow, casting long shadows of the masts across the deck. The sailors moved in a rhythmic dance, their tasks dictated by the boring but essential needs of the ship. They ate their meals in a quiet, rhythmic silence, the sound of spoons against ceramic bowls, a domestic comfort in the middle of the endless blue. The Mary Celeste was sailing through a temporal void, where time was measured not by hours, but by the rhythmic passage of the stars. It was a journey of profound peace, a boring history of a family and a crew moving towards their destination with stoic certainty. Yet beneath this peace lay the eternal mystery of the sea. The cargo of spirits waited in the dark, and the quiet dreams of the Briggs family were about to intersect with a silence so absolute it would echo through the centuries. As the ship drifted further into the unforgiving blue, the siren song of the horizon began to change its tune, leading them. As the Mary Celeste moved further away from the continental shelf, the world transformed into a vast, unbroken circle of cobalt and slate. This was the rhythmic Atlantic, an environment of days of drift where time seemed to lose its linear edge and dissolve into the boring repetition of the swells. The ship was no longer a vessel in a harbor. It was a floating microcosm, a tiny island of wood and canvas navigating a blue horizon that looked exactly the same at noon as it did at dawn. The sound that dominated this period was the hypnotic wash of water against the hull, a constant rhythmic shh that acted as a natural sedative for everyone on board. Captain Briggs maintained a strictly boring discipline. On a ship, routine is the only defense against the madness of the vastness. Every morning at the same hour, the crew would engage in the rhythmic scrubbing of the decks. The sound of holystones, sandstone blocks, grating against the wooden planks was a dull, persistent grumble that echoed the slow movement of the clouds above. These were the daily rhythms that kept the spirit of the ship alive, the meticulous coiling of ropes, the steady pacing of the watchman, and the boringly predictable chiming of the ship's bell every half hour. The architecture of the void. In the middle of the Atlantic, the sky and the sea create an architecture of the void. There are no landmarks, no birds, and often, for days on end, no other ships. The blue horizons offered a sense of profound isolation that was both terrifying and deeply peaceful. Sarah Briggs spent her afternoons in the cabin, the rhythmic click of her sewing machine providing a domestic counterpoint to the heavy groan of the ship's timbers. Little Sophia would play on the floor with her wooden dolls, her laughter a bright, fragile echo in the middle of the silent ocean. The weather during this stretch of the journey was boringly fair. The wind was a steady, rhythmic breath from the west, pushing them toward the Azores at a leisurely pace. Captain Briggs's logbook entries from this time were masterpieces of maritime mundanity. He recorded the barometric pressure, the temperature of the sea, and the monotonous stability of the sails. To an outsider, it was a story of nothing happening. To the crew, it was the perfect symphony of a successful voyage. They were drifting through a temporal fog where the only reality was the wood beneath their feet and the water stretching to the edge of the world. Days of drift and blue horizons. The cargo of spirits in the hold remained a silent, boring presence, Occasionally, during a rhythmic change in the weather, the captain would order the hatches to be checked, ensuring that the fumes of the industrial alcohol were not building up. The heavy wooden hatches being lifted and replaced was a muted, rhythmic thud that punctuated the silence. The crew, mostly German and Danish sailors, spoke little, their lives defined by the repetitive motion of their work. They were men of the sea, comfortable with the boring reality of long-distance sailing, where the most exciting event of the day might be the sighting of a distant whale or a change in the shape of a cloud. The days of drift were marked by a rhythmic beauty that few on land ever witness. At night, the Atlantic became a liquid galaxy, with bioluminescent plankton glowing in the wake of the ship like spectral fireflies. The steady thrum of the wind in the rigging sounded like a giant, distant harp playing a song of deep oceanic sleep. The blue horizon would vanish into the darkness, leaving the Mary Celeste to navigate by the stars, those cold, rhythmic sentinels that had guided sailors for millennia. The lullaby of the unforgiving blue. By late November, the ship was nearing the Azores. The rhythmic lull of the deep had settled over everyone like a heavy blanket. The Mary Celeste was performing with boring excellence, her hull tight and her sails full. There was no premonition of disaster, no rhythmic warning from the sea. There was only the peace of the journey. The blue horizons were finally beginning to show the faint, gray smudge of distant islands, a sign that the days of drift were coming to an end. But the Atlantic is an indifferent giant. Beneath the rhythmic peace of the surface, forces were shifting. Whether it was a seaquake from the ocean floor or a boringly sudden change in atmospheric pressure, the stage was being set for the transition from a floating home to a ghost ship. As the Mary Celeste sailed into the final days of November 1872, the rhythmic breath of the ocean became a whisper of absence, preparing to claim the souls on board and leave behind only the architecture of a... On the afternoon of December 5, 1872, the British brigantine Dei Gratia was cutting through a boring and choppy Atlantic swell, roughly halfway between the Azores and the coast of Portugal. The sky was a heavy, desaturated gray, and the wind was a rhythmic whistle through the rigging. Captain David Morehouse, a friend of Captain Briggs, was at the helm when his lookout called out about a sight of a shadow on the horizon. It was another ship, appearing as a spectral silhouette against the leaden sky. This was an encounter with an empty vessel that would change maritime history forever. As the Dei Gratia drew closer, the rhythm of the sea seemed to change. The approaching ship was the Mary Celeste, but she was moving with a drunken, rhythmic lurch. Her sails were not set correctly. Some were torn, flapping in the wind with a muted, rhythmic slap, while others were strangely furled. There was no one at the wheel, no one on the deck. The ship was a floating ghost, an architecture of absence drifting aimlessly in the unforgiving blue. The sound of the waves hitting her hull was a hollow, rhythmic thud, echoing the emptiness within. The architecture of a ghost. Captain Morehouse watched through his telescope, his heart beating with a rhythmic anxiety. He knew this ship. He knew the man who commanded her, but the Mary Celeste he saw now was a silent specter. There was no rhythmic smoke from the galley chimney, no boring routine of sailors on deck. It was as if the ship had been sucked dry of life in a single moment. The sight of a shadow became a chilling reality as the Dei Gratia pulled alongside, their own engines, or rather the wind in their sails, providing a boring and steady contrast to the chaotic drifting of the ghost ship. A small boarding party was sent across the rhythmic gap between the two vessels. As the sailors climbed onto the deck of the Mary Celeste, the silence was physical. The only sound was the eerie creak of the masts and the rhythmic sigh of the wind. The deck was wet, but the ship was fundamentally sound. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no rhythmic violence. It was simply an empty vessel, a wooden shell left behind by its inhabitants. The architecture of the ship remained intact, but the soul was gone, leaving behind a boringly terrifying mystery. An encounter with an empty vessel. The boarding party moved toward the cabin, their boots making a heavy, rhythmic thud on the deck. They expected to find someone, perhaps a sick crew or a captain in distress. Instead, they found a temporal snapshot of a life interrupted. The cabin was a sanctuary of silence. Everything was in its boring and proper place. The rhythmic ticking of a clock might have been the only sound if it hadn't run down. The beds were made, the clothes were neatly stowed, and Sarah's melodeon stood in the corner, a silent monument to the music that had once filled the space. This was the true horror of the encounter with an empty vessel, the lack of a reason. The ship was not sinking. The cargo of spirits was still there, though some barrels were empty. The boring reality was that the people had simply vanished into the blue. The lifeboats were gone, suggesting a rhythmic departure in a moment of perceived, but perhaps non-existent, danger. The sailors of the Dei Gratia felt a creeping dread, a rhythmic shiver that had nothing to do with the cold Atlantic wind. They were standing in a house of shadows where the days of drift had ended in a total absence. The rhythmic echoes of the departed. As they explored further, the mystery deepened. The logbook's last entry was dated November 25th, 10 days prior. It was a boring entry about the weather and position. For 10 days, the Mary Celeste had been a ghostly voyager, sailing herself through the rhythmic chaos of the Atlantic. She had covered hundreds of miles without a single hand on the wheel. This was the enigma of the drift, the idea of a mechanical persistence in a world of water. The Dei Gratia crew began the boring but necessary task of preparing to tow the vessel to Gibraltar. As they worked, they couldn't help but look over their shoulders at the blue horizons, half expecting to see a small lifeboat appearing from the mist. But there was nothing, only the eternal rhythmic roll of the Atlantic. The sight of a shadow led them to a truth that was dimensionless and silent. The Mary Celeste was no longer a merchant ship. She was a messenger of the unknown, a spectral reminder that the sea can claim the quiet dreams of men without The boarding party from the Dei Gratia moved through the Mary Celeste like ghosts through a tomb. What they found was not a scene of wreckage, but an architecture of absence, a domestic world perfectly preserved yet utterly hollow. The sound of their own breathing felt loud and intrusive against the boring and steady creak of the ship's hull. Every room they entered told a story of a sudden, rhythmic interruption. It was as if a hand had reached down and plucked every living soul from the deck, leaving the untouched logbooks and personal belongings to witness the silence. Legend often speaks of half-eaten meals, warm tea on the table, and half-cooked breakfast in the galley. While the reality found by the sailors was slightly more boring, it was no less haunting. The galley was clean, the pots and pans were in their rhythmic places, and the food supplies were abundant. There was no sign of hunger, no sign of thirst. The architecture of the kitchen remained a place of potential life, yet the fire in the stove had long since gone cold, leaving a stagnant, rhythmic chill in the air. The table was set, not with a feast, but with the quiet expectation of a family that never returned to sit. The rhythmic stillness of the cabin. In the captain's cabin, the architecture of absence was most profound. Sarah Briggs's sewing machine sat on the table, a piece of unfinished cloth still tucked under the needle. Beside it, a bottle of sewing machine oil sat upright, unmoved by the rhythmic toss of the Atlantic. This detail was boringly impossible. How could a ship drift for 10 days in heavy seas without tipping over a small bottle of oil? This created a spectral stillness, a feeling that the ship had been protected by a muted, invisible hand as it traveled through the endless void. On the desk lay the untouched logbooks, the final entries written in Captain Briggs's boringly steady hand. The last entry, dated November 25th, gave no hint of distress. It was a rhythmic notation of longitude and latitude, a mundane record of a successful morning. There were no frantic scribbles, no rhythmic cries for help. Between that final ink stroke and the moment the Dei Gratia arrived, there lay a temporal canyon of 10 days, a silence so thick it seemed to pulse with its own rhythmic life. The architecture of a vanishing. As the searchers moved to the hold, they found the cargo of spirits mostly intact. However, 9 of the 1,701 barrels were empty. This was a boring technical detail that launched 1,000 theories. Had the alcohol leaked? Had the fumes created a rhythmic pressure that terrified the captain? The sound of the hollow barrels, when tapped, produced a dull, rhythmic echo, a sound of emptiness that matched the state of the ship above. There was a faint smell of spirits in the air, a chemical whisper that suggested a hidden danger that may have never truly manifested. The most chilling part of the architecture of absence was what was missing. The ship's longboat was gone. The rhythmic davits, the cranes used to lower the boat, were empty, and the ropes were trailing in the water. This suggested a rhythmic panic, a decision made in seconds to abandon a perfectly sound ship in a tiny open boat on the unforgiving blue of the Atlantic. The echoes of a family. In the corner of the cabin lay Sophia's toys, a boring collection of wooden blocks and a doll. They sat in a rhythmic cluster on the rug, exactly where a 2-year-old would have left them. To the sailors of the Dei Gratia, this was the most heartbreaking architecture. It wasn't the mystery of the cargo or the logbook that haunted them. It was the silent echo of a child's play. The untouched logbooks could not explain why a father would take his daughter and wife into a fragile longboat in the middle of the ocean. As they began the boring and laborious process of towing the Mary Celeste to port, the ship felt heavy, not with weight, but with the psychological mass of the missing. Every rhythmic sway of the ship seemed to ask a question that the architecture of absence refused to answer. The Mary Celeste was a floating question mark, a spectral vessel that carried the quiet dreams of its crew into the annals of history. The half-eaten meals and the still sewing machine were the only monuments left to a family that had vanished into the rhythmic mist, leaving behind a... The arrival of the Mary Celeste in Gibraltar was not a moment of triumph, but the beginning of an eternal drift into the world of myth. As the ghost ship was towed into the shadow of the great rock, the sound of the rhythmic churn of the water against its hull marked the end of its physical journey and the start of a boring and endless legal inquiry. For months, officials poked and prodded at the architecture of absence, searching for a rhythmic clue that simply wasn't there. The truth had remained behind, somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, buried in the vanishing truth of the deep. Over the decades, the mystery of why Captain Briggs and his crew abandoned a perfectly sound ship has inspired a symphony of lingering theories. Some spoke of seaquakes, violent rhythmic tremors from the ocean floor that might have rattled the ship so fiercely that the crew feared it would break apart. Others pointed to waterspouts, those rhythmic pillars of water that can descend from the clouds, creating a boringly sudden vacuum of air and water that could have terrified even the most seasoned sailor. Each theory is a spectral echo, a rhythmic attempt to fill the silence left by the 10 souls who disappeared into the blue. The architecture of the unknown. One of the most boringly plausible theories involves the cargo of spirits. Perhaps the industrial alcohol had leaked, creating a rhythmic accumulation of invisible, explosive fumes in the hold. Fearing an imminent blast, Captain Briggs might have ordered everyone into the longboat, intending to trail behind the ship until the air cleared. But the rhythmic tension of the rope might have snapped during a sudden squall, leaving the family to watch their wooden sanctuary drift away into the mist, a silent messenger they could no longer reach. The sound of this theory is the sharp snap of a hemp rope and the rhythmic splash of oars against an indifferent sea. It is a story of temporal miscalculation, a single decision that led to an eternal drift in an open boat. There are no records of their fate, no rhythmic signal from the waves. They simply became part of the vanishing truth, their voices absorbed by the same siren song of the horizon that had called them from New York. The Mary Celeste itself continued to sail for years after the incident, but she was a haunted vessel in the eyes of the maritime world. She carried a haunted curse, changing hands frequently, her boring commercial missions always overshadowed by the architecture of her past. Eventually, she was wrecked off the coast of Haiti, a rhythmic end for a ship that had already lost its soul. But even as the wood rotted away, the enigma grew stronger, becoming a boring and beautiful part of American and global folklore. Why does this story endure? Because it represents the ultimate enigma. It is a rhythmic reminder that despite our charts, our compasses, and our architecture of order, the ocean remains an untamed void. The vanishing truth of the Mary Celeste is a gift to the imagination, a boring and peaceful space where we can project our own fears and dreams. It is a story that never truly lands, staying forever at sea in the rhythmic shadows of our history. The symphony's final drift, as we close this chapter of the Whispered History Project, the image of the Mary Celeste remains, a spectral brigantine sailing through a temporal fog. The rhythmic lull of the Atlantic continues, its waves unchanged by the tragedies and mysteries that unfold upon its surface. The story of Captain Briggs, Sarah, and little Sophia is now a boring and eternal lullaby, a symphony of absence that invites us to let go of the need for answers. The eternal drift is not a tragedy of the past, but a rhythmic presence in the present. It teaches us that some secrets are meant to be kept by the sea, wrapped in the vanishing truth of the deep. As the lights dim and the steady thrum of the ocean fills our ears, we can finally find peace in the unknown. The Mary Celeste is still out there, in the architecture of our dreams, sailing silently towards a horizon that never ends, under a sky that holds its breath in eternal rhythmic peace.